Most people shouldn't start startups. It's not about who you know. It's about what you do. The best location on earth is San Francisco. The second best place for startups is actually the internet. The people who are most willing to put themselves out there don't actually put themselves out there with like anything that they've done. They just put themselves out there for the sake of putting themselves out there. So they kind of just like put slop content out on the internet.
So it has gotten easier for you to produce stuff, but harder for you to get the distribution.
The real challenge when it comes to having distribution is actually having something that's worth like distributing. But Product Hunt is probably the worst place to really get a true pulse.
Doing what is hot right now, is that the right way to go about it?
Sometimes you'll just hear something that will just completely blow your mind. Quote unquote vibe coding is like the normal thing. The reality is if you build something and you understand who you're building for, ideally it's you.
Hi everyone, I'm Ishan Sharma, live from San Francisco, and this podcast is really important. With me, I have Julian from ODF, On Deck Foundation, and a lot of you would have seen me travel to San Francisco over the last 9 months and would be curious about what am I doing here. And one thing that I see everywhere around me are 18, 20, 22-year-old founders who are building and shipping every single day. And then I see majority of the 18, 20-year-olds in India who are going to colleges that they don't like, enrolled in degrees that might not be meaningful to them, sitting in placements and doing jobs which might not be their calling as such. This podcast is all about how you can start a company and then maybe figure out how can you come to San Francisco. And with me, I have Julian, who has helped so many people figure out their path of building a startup. And we'll be talking about AI as well in this entire podcast. Julian, thank you so much for taking out the time. How are you doing there?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. This is going to be really fun.
Amazing. I had a huge monologue over there to set the context, but tell me about Julian, you as a person, and ODF itself. If you had to like summarize what ODF has done, how did you get started, and what's the impact that you've had on the age group that I've just mentioned?
Yeah, we'll start from the impact that ODF has had. ODF has helped over 1,000 companies launch. They've raised billions of dollars now, and that's only in 6 years. And the reason that we do this is because we believe that there are too few startups getting started. Now, there's a couple of things that seem contradictory, but are actually very complementary. First is this belief that there are too few startups. We also believe that most people shouldn't start startups. But then we also believe on top of that, that too few people are actually exploring starting them. So ODF brings people together in San Francisco to explore whether or not they should start a startup. And if they should start a startup, figure out what those missing pieces are. So for instance, who might I start it with? What might we build? Who might the initial customers be? And the idea here is to bring those people who maybe are very close to starting a startup, maybe have a high degree of certainty, but also some people who are saying, hey, maybe there's a 50% chance that I start a startup, or I'm not sure, but I really want to make sure that I actually go through the process of exploring and seeing what that's like. So that's what ODF is. Again, we've been doing it for 6 years now, 1,000 companies. Me personally, I'm just really obsessed about this intersection of ideas and ambitious people. There are a lot of ways that you can combine ideas and ambitious people. I actually went to school for music before getting into technology. And it turns out that the difference between combining music as sort of a form of an idea and ambitious people is not all that much different between that and technology or film. I consider technology as another form of expression, artistic expression. So and the nice thing about it is it's much more commercially oriented. So you don't have this sort of artist's dilemma, because sometimes artists have a fear of actually making money, and charging things and being commercial. Yep. So I've been doing this now for 6 years with ODF. It's been incredible. And, the thing that we've seen is just how many people come and end up finding conviction and moving to San Francisco from all over the place, from other parts of the United States, from Europe, from Japan, from India. And it's just so fantastic to see that, because our goal here is how do we make more startups? And part of the way that we do that is by helping more people come here to build them.
There's a lot to unpack here. We'll be talking about all of that. But before I want to understand, do you have some stories or examples that my audience can relate to about people, students from India who've come to San Francisco, joined ODF, and have built a product and launched it, gotten great success with it, built great revenue for it, maybe acquired or they're still running it? Do you have some examples like that?
Totally. I mean, well, there's some that have come to the United States. There's some that are still building in India. But one person that immediately comes to mind is Ishan Sharma. I believe that he did ODF when he was like 17 years old or maybe even younger. He at the time was working on something in Web3. But the thing about the time that we see people at ODF is that they're very much in the exploratory phase. So what they're working on then might look very different than what they're working on today. And now he's working on a really compelling product for AI agents to essentially help people with small businesses be much more effective. So everybody is working with AI agents, and typically they're working with companies that are startups who are trying to use AI agents to gain more leverage. He's really focusing on these smaller businesses, and that change and that focus that he's developed over the last couple of years has been incredible. He's raised money from a who's who of investors, notably Sam Altman, and it's been incredible to see him come here as somebody who had no connections to San Francisco, build something. And I think the thing that maybe your audience would benefit from hearing is that it's not about who you know, it's about what you do.
Yeah.
And if you do great things, people will come to you. They'll be so excited to come to you, but they need to know that you exist, right? So it's about putting yourself out there.
Discoverability.
Yeah, it's about discoverability. It's about, you could be in San Francisco and be discoverable, but you could also be on the internet and be discoverable. My favorite thing to say is that, in my opinion, the best place on earth for building startups, the best location on earth is San Francisco. The second best place for startups is actually the internet, and maybe the third place is New York City or somewhere else. But the idea is that you can actually be in the second best place in the world for startups, no matter where you live. And you could also, if you're an SF, you could be in both, right? You could be in the first best and the second best.
Very cool. I think I got to spend a lot of time with Aryan. Induced AI is what he's building. He's from Mumbai. And I just love the depth of insights that he has over everything that he's doing. And I think a lot of people look up to him who know him in India around that age bracket.
Have you had him on the show before?
I really want to. So
you got it, yeah.
Sometime maybe in this trip.
That'd be awesome. That would be really cool.
That'd be really amazing. So that's an example of someone who went through ODF from India and has built a big company and is working on that. Let's come to the idea of building startups. And before that, I want to talk about what are the most important skills that you think people should learn before they start building something, and how can they start learning those skills individually? Like if you had to give like a step-by-step tutorial or like a walkthrough for how can they learn those skills?
Yeah, so I think that most people have some things that are kind of innate to them, things that they're predisposed to being good at. But for many, you need to develop muscles, right? Some people are again, there's some genetic predispositions to having stronger certain types of muscles than others. But ultimately, these are things that you need to develop. I think that one thing that's sort of a really important thing to develop isn't actually skills like computer engineering, but I think it's actually the ability to put yourself out there. And I think that there's this really interesting thing that happens, which is that some of the people who are most willing to put themselves out there don't actually put themselves out there with like anything that they've done. They just put themselves out there for the sake of putting themselves out there. So they kind of just like put slop content out on the internet. They just post random shit. They're literally just shit posting. And they're not actually producing anything of real meaning. Those people don't care. They just like put things out into the world. They have no fear of judgment or anything like that. But on the other end of it, you have the people who are really good at making things, but they're deathly afraid of putting things out there, being judged, having people say that their thing isn't good, right? So it's this really interesting thing, because what you really want is you want both of those things, right? You want somebody who doesn't really care, who's not that scared, who doesn't have the stage fright, but then you also want them to have the ability to make meaningful things. So if you can make stuff and develop that muscle of not being worried about putting it out into the world, especially putting it out into the world early, that's really the ideal. I think that the need to be able to really understand how to code is less and less important in the very early days. Now, is it nice to have? Absolutely. And being an engineer, is that going to be devalued? I don't think so, really. But I think that nowadays you really have no excuses. You have to get things out into the world much sooner. And especially if you look at what people are looking for, if you're trying to build a venture scale startup, people are looking for more product traction or more product progress than ever before in the early days, because the costs of actually making these things are so low.
So it has gotten easier for you to produce stuff, but harder for you to get the distribution and eyesight, people signing up and users on it.
I wouldn't even necessarily know if it's actually that much harder to get distribution than it was before. I think that the real challenge when it comes to having distribution is actually having something that's worth like distributing, right? So if you don't have anything that's worth putting good enough that's worth putting out there, then maybe you just post jokes or something online. And there are some people, by the way, who actually started out just like posting random stuff online, developed an audience, and now they're building like very meaningful businesses. There's Julius AI. um, Beth Bezos. Like there are people who are actually started out by posting a lot of stuff. They weren't posting about what they were working on. So that can work, but most people don't actually cross the chasm from posting funny content online to actually like making meaningful businesses. That's a chasm that's rarely crossed. So I think it's really this: if you put good things out there, you actually have something meaningful to talk about. And good isn't necessarily polished. It's interesting. It's
Something of
compelling. It's
value.
something that people find worthwhile to talk about or to try. So I think that it's that combination of developing that and putting it out there. I think that also, a lot of people really anchor on things like launching on Product Hunt. I think that that's great, to some extent. But Product Hunt is probably the worst place to really get a true pulse on a lot of your customers, unless you're a very specific type of product, because it's most people who are going to be buying your product are not Product Hunt people, unless you're like square in the demographic of Product Hunt, in which by which you should go for it.
Right.
But so many people that I talk to who are at ODF or outside of ODF, and they're saying, yeah, we're really gearing up for this Product Hunt launch. We're going to ask all these people to upvote us. Doesn't really matter for a lot of these businesses because they're not actually like the target audience of Product Hunt.
That was an interesting insight, because I think since 2020, every year I've launched products, like either in the company that I was working with or as a agency working with companies, helping them launch their own Product Hunt launches. But we'll talk about that Product Hunt and marketing and how to get users.
Sure.
But before that, you talked about the intersection of having the distribution while having the ability to build something valuable and then taking it together to launch stuff. That's valuable. But now, once someone knows this, the next step is to figure out the idea for what they want to build. And in today's world of generative AI and AI agents, there's so much that you can be building. It also comes with a lot of doubt and not knowing what to choose. Like, how can someone decide what idea is right for them? If a 20-year-old is watching this video right now, how can they decide that this is the idea, this is the product that I want to build? Or is it more of a discoverability process that I'm just building stuff, seeing what works, launching it, and then going ahead with that? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In fact, I was just hearing Zach from Cal AI, who did ODF a couple cohorts ago, talking about this yesterday. There could be this search, this process of going through, hey, like, is this an idea that resonates with people? Should we go and scale that up? Should we abandon this idea and go work on something else? And Cal AI is a remarkable company. In under a year, I think they have 5 million users, and I think it's something crazy like 24 million ARR.
What does Cal AI do?
So Cal AI it's kind of like if you think about MyFitnessPal, which is a really popular app for sort of calorie tracking and meal logging. It's like that, but from more photo-based and really using AI. If you look at MyFitnessPal, which is a very popular app still, doesn't really use AI at all. It's kind of shocking. And Cal AI is kind of the exact opposite. They're saying don't have to put this all in manually, just snap a photo. And they've just been doing phenomenally well. Again, this is like a team of 3 people, I think. Zach is still in high school.
He's 17, right?
He's 17.
He's in New York. I was about to meet
I don't know
him.
if he's 17 now, but he's still in high school. He might be 18. But he's graduating from high school soon. But he's building an app that has 24 million ARR bootstrapped from his high school science class. He'll post photos of it online. And I guess like the interesting story there is that they started with a bunch of other things. And they were just trying to figure out like what is the thing that will resonate, what is the thing that will grow. They were working on one that was for essentially you take a screenshot of of like an outfit that you see on Instagram, and then it helps you figure out what that outfit is. But the problem is that people don't have like an immediate burning need. Like that might be a thing that they need to do in the future, but they don't have like a bunch of those photos saved up, is what he was saying. So like ultimately it's this sort of hard growth problem to from a product standpoint. But usually people have food that they need to like snap a photo of immediately. Like people eat 3 times a day usually, sometimes more if they're snacking. So like the likelihood of somebody actually like downloading the app and then immediately using it is much higher with Cal. And it's just a much more recurring need that people have for food logging. There are also people who are actively trying to solve the food logging problem, or they might be using other tools that they would switch to. So it just became obvious that like it made sense. And I think they did a couple of other ideas in between those two, but it's the first one. This is the one that they ended up with. They also realized that they wanted to like really focus on one. So initially they were thinking about like trying a bunch at the same time. And I think there's a lot of value to just really focusing on just one thing. And then, if you realize it's not working out, you can move on to other things. Another company, it's called Finch. It's an ODF company. They're building an API for essentially employment data, and incredibly successful, growing insanely quickly. But they started out just two guys who were trying to figure out what they wanted to work on together, right? And they started with an idea that's almost hilarious in hindsight. They were building like creator tools or something, and like none of them had creator experience. Like they were just doing whatever was hot at the time. And the reality is, when you have that happen, it's fine as long as you know that you're going to potentially move on to something else. The real issue is if you have a co-founder and they want to stick with the idea for an irrationally long time, even though it's clear nothing works, nothing makes sense, and they have no unique insight. So what you could do is you could do one of two things. You could be extremely sensitive to what it is that you start working on, or you could just start working on pretty much anything with the sort of stated acknowledgement that you are going to be moving on from this idea most likely. If you start with anything though, and you're working with a co-founder, it's a great way to just test your relationship, right? Because you don't really know what it's like to work with someone until you actually start working with them. So better to like make that progress and have those learnings early on than try to like delay the actual building process and like learning together and experiencing what it's like to work together process, in favor of finding the perfect idea, because you might actually come up with the perfect idea through the process of working together.
I think we're talking about this. Doing what is hot right now, is that the right way to go about it? Because, for example, today we are seeing AI agents, right? YC is funding all AI agent companies.
Sure.
The Winter 25 batch, same as with the new batch that they're having, the spring batch. So every company that is coming out getting funding is AI agents companies or are just building something in the field of AI. So should everyone who's watching this video also build an AI company because it's hot? What is your thinking about that?
Yeah,
It's very easy to just look at that and get flowed.
Yeah, so on our walk yesterday, we were talking a little bit about this, and I think that there was something, there's something to be said about building in a hot space, right? Building in a hot space, there are good reasons to do it, and there are bad reasons to do it. The bad reason to do it is to build in it because it's hot and because you think it's easier to raise money or something like that. The good reason to do it is because it probably is hot for a reason, right? Because there's a great opportunity there. And especially when it comes to AI, and you think about all of these legacy industries, right? Well, there's so many industries that have not been impacted in a positive way by AI yet, right? That's just 100% true. And that means that there's this huge opportunity to go after those industries. But if you're just kind of arbitrarily saying, I'm going to do AI agents or I'm going to do AI because that's the thing that investors want to hear, that's not the way to go and do it, right? The way to go and do it is to say, like, what is this new tool or this new technology wave that's causing me to want to, build a company? Think about like mobile, right? Think about like GPS on your phone, right? Think about just the the internet in general, right? Back in the day, it's like all of these waves, and I think Web3 was a little bit different, but like these true technology waves that are happening right now, with AI, they really harken back to these other platform shifts and things like that. And when you think about it from that perspective, it's like, okay, well, a lot of things are changing. Pretty much everything's changing. So how do I get involved, or how do I take that acknowledgement that things are changing and apply it to a business that I might want to build. A really good example of this is Magic School, right? Magic School said, okay, there is this incredible new technology, AI. They saw ChatGPT, the founder of Deal, saw ChatGPT. He was a former high school principal. He had started the high school. And before that, he'd been a teacher in many different capacities. And he said, this ChatGPT thing is amazing for teachers. Teachers in the United States, I don't know about other parts of the world, are more sort of stressed for resources than ever before. They have less money, they have less time, they have more students. So they just have so much more in terms of responsibilities than ever. And AI, Adil looked at this, he said, ChatGPT is great, right? This is something that these teachers can use. It'll be really beneficial to them. So he actually went to his school to try and give a demonstration to show how great ChatGPT is and how you could use it. And the teachers thought the presentation was pretty cool. But then when he followed up with them, he said, how's it going? And most of them didn't use ChatGPT afterwards because there was just this huge sort of blank slate problem, right? Where ChatGPT is this blank screen where you just have to type stuff in. It's not specialized.
From
These aren't
scratch, you have
tools.
to do it.
From scratch, yeah, every single time, right? And it's a great sort of Swiss Army knife. But the problem with Swiss Army knives is that most people aren't going to be using them to like cut their steak, right? So the thing is that he realized that, okay, wait a second. I tried to get them to use this tool that already existed because I thought it'd be great for them. It turns out it doesn't actually solve their problems. So he ended up building Magic School, which is, at the start, it was this series of little micro apps that were kind of like modified versions of ChatGPT, right? Where each one of them had a very specific purpose. And he built this and it immediately just started to go off, right? And the reason it went off and the reason it's gotten millions of teachers using it and now just loads of students using it as well is because of this insight that the current thing, the ChatGPT, wasn't going to actually solve their problems. And I think there's this really interesting learning for the audience here, which is that it's not just about the tech inflection point. There's also an inflection point around society or around the sector, right? So sort of the sector inflection point for Magic School was that teachers were being asked to do more with less, right? They were being really constrained by all of this work that they needed to do outside of actually teaching. And Magic School said, hey, what if we gave you 10 more hours in the week? To be freed up so you can spend it with students, you can spend it with their parents. You could also just have a little bit more time to like actually recover and be able to do great work in the classroom. So sometimes it's about combining those two inflection points or those two why nows.
Amazing. So that's about if you should do the hot thing or not. What are the most important problems according to you that are worth solving for people who are watching who don't have an insight as such? If they want to understand about the most pressing concerns today and what do you see problems or ideas that people are working on in SF which work really well and people really want that?
It's a great question because the reality is anytime you ask somebody who isn't the founder of a company, they are going to give a pretty bad answer. So I'm going to sort of avoid answering the question specifically, but I'll give you what I think is actually a really important thing to think about. First, I think that many great startups don't seem like they're going to be very consequential in the beginning. They actually seem very quaint, right? Dropbox, many people mocked it as a feature, right? Steve Jobs infamously mocked it as a feature. Somebody at Hacker News said it's arbitrarily easy to do it. There are all of these people who will say that some products are actually just like small things that won't actually have an impact. Dropbox is obviously a very successful company now. It's one that's helped a lot of people. They've expanded beyond just like the initial folder that syncs, but even the folder that syncs was actually a really powerful and compelling product. A lot of people doubted Magic School in the beginning. And I'm sure they'll continue to doubt it, some people, but the reality is we wouldn't, most people wouldn't have the insight of what Adil did because he was a high school principal. So I think it's a combination of, do you have a unique insight? And also, are you working on something sometimes that seems small today, but can be really big in the future? So I don't think that sometimes like you ask like big problems worth solving. A lot of these things will actually seem like rather small problems in the early days. And then the other thing is, or at least small businesses in the early days. And the other thing is sometimes you'll just hear something that will just completely blow your mind, but you just haven't thought about it. So I try to keep a really open mind as to what might come in through the door and be like the next great idea. I was doing some user tests on an ODF app that we were building a couple of years ago now, and I had one person, Celine Haliwa, she was doing an in-person user test of this app, and I completely like bombed this user test. Like the app didn't load. It was really embarrassing.
The ODF app.
Yeah, the ODF app at the time. It was really embarrassing. And at the end, I was like, okay, well, it'll be better when it goes actually live for people to use it. And I said, well, what's going on with you? And she said, oh, I'm building a dog longevity company. And I
Wow.
said, okay, I never heard of anybody building a dog longevity company. What does that actually mean? And until you hear that idea, it's not one that you would think of, right? But when you hear it, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you could actually cause dogs to live longer, I grew up with dogs. Everybody wants their dog to live longer. So ultimately, sometimes these ideas are just so crazy, but you wouldn't have the idea to think of them until
And how
they
did
come in the
she
door.
get the idea for that?
Well, she'd worked sort of in biotech and longevity. She was chief of staff at the Longevity Fund, and she grew up with animals her entire life. And she just really loved dogs. And there was this incredible insight there that that dogs have an interesting dynamic where large breed dogs age much faster biologically, and they die much earlier than small breed dogs. There's an interesting discrepancy there, and then there's also something really fascinating about the fact that if you could actually do something with dogs, like maybe you could eventually do something with humans as well. Celine never mentioned this to me, but I think one thing that's also really interesting is the fact that if you start with dogs, human longevity, I think, is like this weirdly controversial thing. I think that people have these like boogeyman ideas around human longevity.
Brian
Um,
Johnson.
was it?
Brian Johnson.
Yeah, I think even that, but I think like the idea that longevity drugs might only be accessible to the rich or something like that, maybe is sort of the boogeyman sort of thing. When in reality, like that's just not the case with most drugs. Um, and I think that if you start with dogs, it's just like unobjectable, right? Like people will not say, "Oh, how dare you want your dog to live longer?" You know what I mean? It's just a much better way to sort of like
Harmless.
make the conversation, sort of move the conversation of longevity. So I think that what she's doing isn't just good for dogs and the people who love the dogs, but I think it's also just like generally amazing for the field of longevity.
Very interesting. So that's about the idea. We talked about interesting problems to solve. Now, let's say someone has found an idea and they want to start building that. The first step is to actually build it, to code it out, to make the platform. And they don't know how to code, but they want to start learning it. In 2025, what do you think a 20-year-old needs to start building products, to start coding? If someone has to just build a product, build an MVP, and share it with people and launch it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we're really at this crazy sort of point where I think the people who are going to learn to code are going to learn to code in just such a functionally different way than people who were learning to code 2 years ago, and especially those who were learning to code 5 years ago. So what that actually looks like is pretty up in the air. I think that nobody actually has a real crystal ball on what this is. There are a lot of people who sort of like similar to how some people grew up, maybe this is you, like grew up like with just like an iPhone was a normal thing, or like a smartphone was a normal thing. There are going to be people who grow up where like quote unquote vibe coding is like the normal thing, and
What
the
is vibe
idea,
coding to people who don't
yeah.
know?
So vibe coding is this idea that you're kind of you're somewhat focused more on like the English language or whatever language you're speaking, and that's the sort of interface to an AI that then does the coding on your behalf. So it's almost like you are commanding AI to go and build products for you, and the AI is the one that's actually writing the code. So you're kind of one level removed from the actual coding. And this kind of allows you to use natural language to command the AI. Ultimately, I think the biggest challenge with this, well, first off, the best part. The best part is that now anybody can code apps. It's really remarkable. I recommend Replit as the way to get started. You don't even need a computer. You can just do it with a smartphone. remarkable. So many people, including people that I've met, who in Merge, which is this microgrant community we run, they have built companies or built apps with the Replit mobile app. And they learned to code using Replit Mobile. This is before they had all of the AI agents and vibe coding even. It was just like they were able to code on there. And that unlocked coding for so many people, the fact that it was available on this mobile device. But I think that the way to get started is using Replit or using some other product like Replit to just start typing in, in your language naturally what you want. And then you'll see sort of how the code gets constructed. And as you do this, the more hours you put into it, you will start to see a little bit more about what's breaking, what's not working, and you'll need to troubleshoot. And this is actually the challenging part right now about vibe coding, is that you can create a bunch of things. The real challenge comes from the debugging process. When you actually hit an error, it's still really hard to understand if you've never coded before what the errors are and how to get around them. So I think that that's probably the biggest advantage that sort of full stack engineers have right now when it comes to vibe coding. Also, I think that they can give more of a nuanced
in-depth
prompt, exactly. They can give a descriptions about sort of what the stack should be and things like that, versus if you're just being very vague and you say, build me a to-do list app, well, you're kind of outsourcing all of the judgment around what stack that should be built with to the AI.
So that's basically how someone can get started building a product from scratch. Let's say they've built it. Let's say they also deployed it with Replit. Now, the first challenge is to actually get users on board. And then we talk about funding or bootstrapping it. But if someone wants to start launching their product, how should the launch look like? And what have you seen? What have you learned from the best launches that you've seen in the last 1 year for people who are launching products from scratch?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm not necessarily a huge fan of product launches in the sense that like there's one day where we're launching the product. And if that happens, it usually happens after you've actually launched beforehand, but you just haven't made a big deal about it. And the second launch or the launch day is, okay, we figured all of our things out. We know that people, if they find out about this, they're going to be really excited about it. So we're now going to launch, and now people are going to go there. They're going to be able to successfully sign up. They're going to be able to successfully use the product. It will deliver on the value proposition that we're promising. So it's better to have those launch days after you've figured a bunch of things out. But the best thing you could do is build a product that actually solves a problem. And the only way you can really know it solves a problem is if it solves a problem for you. A deal from Magic School, great example, right? The first product that Magic School built, they built over a weekend. It was a couple of these micro tools for teachers. He knew exactly what the first products would be that would be useful for teachers because he was a teacher himself. He made a little Loom video sort of overviewing what the product is. I highly recommend using Loom to do product demos and then share them with people. And then he sent that Loom video out and he sent the link out to a handful of teachers. And by the end of the week, 100 people were using it, right? Wow. And it wasn't like he sent it out to hundreds of teachers or anything like that. But the reality is if you build something and you understand who you're building for, ideally it's you, but you understand who you're building for, like you will get some feedback really quickly. You asked about how to get users. Well, it's really easy to get users if you are one of them, because you will likely know other people who are like you. If you aren't the user, then you need to do a lot more work on the front end to really talk to the potential users, understand what their problems are before writing a single line of code or, vibe coding a single sentence or whatever, right? Because if you do that, you will have a good understanding of, are you actually building towards solving their problem?
Yeah. I think most people in SF especially end up building a B2B tool, which they are not the users of themselves.
Maybe.
So in cases like that, how should they focus on acquiring users, or do you think is the right way to do it? Is it Twitter? Is it, as you said, Product Hunt? Or are there any other ways to do it? And how do you create viral hacks so that people keep recommending it and it grows on its own?
So there are a couple great examples here. So one, I actually think that many people who are building B2B tools ideally actually are sort of former customers, like at their prior jobs, they might have had experience. But if we're talking to your audience and they maybe haven't had that much professional work experience, maybe that's not that useful. But I just will say that, when people are building B2B SaaS or they're building API companies, oftentimes that is informed by what they needed at their last company. But if you don't have much professional experience yet, or you're not deeply networked into sort of like how Silicon Valley works, and that you want those to be your early customers, the absolute best thing you can do is just be active on X, in my opinion, or Twitter. Because if you're active there, and by active I mean like you're engaging with people in a meaningful way, you're following like niche accounts. You don't want to follow just like Sam Altman. Fine, it's like fine to follow him, right, on Twitter. But what you want to do is you want to follow people. I think the richness here is in following people with
People in the
10,000 or
trenches who are, like, actually building
less
stuff.
followers. Yeah. And like, the more followers that they have, the less likely, and obviously there are some people who are going to be highly responsive with a lot of followers. But the fewer followers that they have, the more likely it is that they're just like, active on Twitter, but they're not treating it as like, this is like a big platform for me to build an audience. It's like a place for them to engage and learn and that sort of thing. People are very responsive to cold DMs. There is a founder in ODF24 named Nemanja, and he is building a tool. At least right now, he's building a tool to make it so that it helps people prevent Cursor from hallucinating code. So what we were talking about earlier with like debugging being a problem, for professional developers, like developers who have a much larger code base, another big problem is that Cursor, when it has a huge amount of code in the code base, can tend to hallucinate and start to like make things up.
Overdo things sometimes.
Overdo things, like make errors, because it kind of like imagines things. And what he does is he just messages some people sometimes on X, and he says, hey, I saw you posted this thing about, Cursor having hallucination issues. Like, is that still a problem for you? And they'll say, yeah. And they'll say, cool, like, I'm working on this thing. We have a couple dozen customers so far, whatever it is. And, our goal is to make it so that we solve the hallucination problem. And if that's interesting, happy to show you what we're working on. And people respond very favorably to that because he's not doing this like annoying sales pitch. He's actually underplaying things, right? He's saying we have a bunch of users, right? He's not trying to say like we're super professional, because you know what happens usually when you get these DMs. You probably get these. I get a lot of them. Is they're very salesy, and they're like, we're the best thing in the world. We have so many people who are using it. They try to really pump themselves up. But what people really like in Silicon Valley is to actually be early users of things. They want to have the edge. So if everybody's already using it, it's like, cool, like maybe I should also use it. But if you're the first person to potentially be using it, like you might have 3 months of advantage before everybody else starts adopting it. And some of these things, especially for AI stuff, like 3 months of advantage can put you really far ahead of other people.
It was Clubhouse in 2020, and now it's what is the equivalent of Clubhouse?
That's interesting. I don't know. I think that X is still really highly undervalued. I think that cold DMs are highly undervalued. Cold emails too, to an extent, that you have to find people's email. The thing about X is that most people have their DMs open. So you literally can just DM anybody versus like you have to try and figure out people's emails. And then if you email people, then they're like, well, they might be like, well, how did they get my email or whatever. It's also really easy to overdo it on an email, like because there's just so much space. So people end up writing these like short novels, right? But I think that the main thing though is as long as you keep it short, you keep it earnest, meaning you don't try to like puff yourself up. You actually make it so you seem like, hey, like, we're really early on. But if this seems like something that's useful to you, I'd love to share more. And then also you don't try to get onto a synchronous call with the person. I think this is actually really important. People always try and ask to get on a live call. The reality is you can just DM back and forth a bunch. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, most people are very happy to DM back and forth.
What if they forgot or they missed out?
What do you mean?
Like, let's say you're talking to someone on Twitter DM and they just like forgot about you, then they got like 10 more messages.
And now your chat is like, just bump it up. Like, the reality is, like, if you bump it up a couple of times and they don't respond, then obviously it's not a priority, right? Somebody, I think it was him, somebody was messaging me about, hey, like some customers or some potential customers are saying this is way too expensive. And then others are saying, like, it's a great price and I'm happy to pay for it. What should you think about that? It's like, well, it's awesome that some people are saying it's too expensive because they would be a pain to work with. Because what you want is people who are hearing the price and they're like, this is great. Like, this is exciting. Like, this is going to solve a real problem for me. You don't want to worry about it being a great price for everyone. You just want it to be a great price for enough people to be meaningful in the early days.
Makes a lot of sense. So we talked about launching. Now, let's say someone thinks about growing. Let's say they have like 50 users,
Sure.
out of which, let's say, 30 of them are paying or some number like that. Now they want to scale it further, and the logical thing to do, which everyone else does, is to actually raise money.
Yeah.
Now, how should someone think about, should they go the raising round, which is like applying for different cohorts and batches and VCs, or just building it as a slow business, which I've done in the last
Sure.
3-4 years, building my own company, and just focusing on building a real business which has recurring revenue, which has profit margins, and just builds it like that. A lifestyle business versus a high growth blitzscaling company, for example. How should someone decide what to do?
So first off, my friend Heaton Shah says, you shouldn't call things necessarily, unless you really want to, like lifestyle businesses or bootstrap businesses. He calls them self-funded businesses.
Self-funded.
Because the reality is, and I think this is true more than ever before, is that self-funded businesses can be massive businesses. I mean, just look at Cal AI. I realized I said it was bootstrapped earlier, but it's self-funded, right? And now it's self-funded from all the revenue, right? So they take all of the money that they make, they put it right back into the business. I think that's a great method. The real question is how fast can you grow, and what's the actual limiting factor for growth? Sometimes the limiting factor for growth is money. Other times it is, that you haven't cracked the messaging, right? I think that Cal AI is a great example of, they really figured out growth. And it wasn't they didn't need external funding to really ramp up growth. So your business might not need that either. I mean, Magic School, before they had any meaningful funding, they had, million people using it. I'm pretty sure that they have like way more money in the bank than they did like when they raised. And like the thing that's so cool about this is that you no longer have this like hard binary, right? You can go and you can self-fund something. Then you can take it to a point where you reach an inflection, and then you raise one round of funding, and then maybe you never raise again. Or you raise a small amount of money in the early days, you go all the way to maybe $100 million valuation or $1 billion valuation. Zapier raised a small amount of money in the early days, and I think that the next time that they raise money is like a multi-billion dollar valuation, right? So there's really no right or wrong way to do it. It's just what's right or wrong for your business. And I also think that there's this this misconception that that growth is always tied to money, like external money. I don't think that's necessarily true, and I think that that's especially less true nowadays. But it depends on the type of business. It also depends. Growth is sometimes not is based more on like hiring, right? So sometimes you might need to hire more people to accomplish more things.
Let's say, for example.
Sales, maybe, though I do think that most companies could get away with less salespeople earlier on than ever before. Look at just about sort of how you deal with inbound. There's one company that I know, I shouldn't say who it is, but they have specific. They have AI agents for different zip codes. So what they do is, if it's a certain zip code, they will send it to an AI agent. If it's another zip code that they know is like a higher dollar value for them on average, like a much higher dollar value or a much higher retaining customer, they'll go to a live human. So in the past, it would have been all of the inbound calls or all the inbound requests going to a live human. Now they've taken it away and said, okay, only the highest value potential customers are going to a live human, and the conversion on the other people is who are going to the agent is pretty much the same. But they just want to make sure they roll out the red carpet for the absolute biggest customers. But that's a good example of, you don't need as much money to do sales as you once did.
I think there was a tweet by Sam Altman in which he said that it will very soon be possible to run $1 billion company by just yourself, like a single person $1 billion company, using AI to sort of automate all of those tasks and have AI agents as employees. If that were to be true, how do you think someone should use that, or how can they use AI to like sort of create employees that would do the work on their behalf, if there has to be a workflow like that?
Yeah, I think it's probably true that that's going to happen. I mean, there's definitely businesses that are multi-million dollar profitable businesses that are, one person on the team, and maybe they have some external sort of virtual assistant type type folks who are working with them remotely. I definitely could see that. The real question is like, what kind of business do you want to build, right? Because my guess is, at least for the foreseeable future, the solo founder, operator, proprietor who doesn't have any full-time teammates, that's going to be like a very specific type of business and will only attract a specific type of person. So like, if you're interested in that, that's great, but there could be other businesses that absolutely require more people.
Right.
Traba, the co-founders met through ODF. They're probably the most successful marketplace around right now. They're making it so that that businesses can get flexible staffing. And there's no way that that type of business is going to be a single person building $1 billion company. Like, the operational complexity, and they're always going to need to have humans in the loop, like IRL humans in the loop for certain types of work, or at least for like the next decade plus, right? Like, so that business, if you want to build that type of business, you're not going to be able to follow the Sam Altman tweet, even directionally. You'll be able to get more scale and more effectiveness and more leverage per person with AI. But at the end of the day, you're not building the solo person company. So it really just depends on what you're trying to do.
What's an example of let's say, an idea or a product which wouldn't require as many employees? Let's say, for example, if you had to like give an example to people.
I mean, pure software, definitely. Things like Cal AI are getting close. It's a really good question because like it really depends on sort of the capabilities of the AI at the time. Right now, it's hard to imagine, but in the future, when AI could actually like really go off and be dependable, like much more than sort of a junior employee, which is what it feels like right now, from the agent perspective, that could be really good. I mean, right now you're essentially like, you're almost like pair programming with the AI when you're sort of like looking at it and interacting with it as it does its steps. Even some of these AI agents, like, you don't even get notified when they're done. You kind of have to like keep checking back to see when they're done.
Right.
Like, there's all of this like weirdness around that. So
there was a tweet somewhere which said that, hey, dear cursor, once you finish writing all their code, just have a notification bell so that I can know that it's done.
Totally, yeah. And ultimately, like, people are using multiple instances of Cursor at the same time, so they're already kind of doing this, like, where they're having like multiple tentacles off of them, right? But at the end of the day, it's still very difficult to actually nail that. And I think that we're going to get there, but the question really is like, what are the capabilities of the AI? And my guess is that will continue to increase exponentially. I think that our ability to use AI will lag behind AI's capabilities. Like it will take time for us as humans to adapt to using AI. The AI will outpace us. So the real question is like, how quickly do we come up to speed on these tools?
The AI will outpace us.
Yeah, the AI's improvements and capabilities will outpace our ability to actually go and utilize those capabilities.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
The next part of this discussion I wanted to have was around coming to Silicon Valley.
Sure.
So a lot of people who are watching these videos have seen me come here, acquire clients for my agency, and I've also talked and interviewed a lot of people, Dravya, for example, who launched Super Memory.
Yeah.
So stuff like that happens a lot. If someone wants to come here, what is, number one, the reason to come here, the right reason to come here that you've seen people have? And how can they sort of fund it? Because obviously it's going to be very expensive, especially from India to coming to US.
Sure.
And then what are the perks of living in San Francisco? What do you think?
Cool. So Dravya is awesome.
Yeah.
I was just talking with him this weekend. One of my favorite people. For context, for people who don't know, have you had him on the podcast before?
I've had
cool.
Great discussion on the
Cool.
podcast
So
really well.
For people who haven't listened or watched that one, he's building sort of the infrastructure for memory when it comes to AI. And it's an incredibly important sort of area of AI and sort of capabilities with AI. And he's doing it all sort of solo. He's been entirely by himself building this. He has GitHub contributors, and he's got sort of a community of people in a Discord. But it's been really remarkable to see him build that business. He's a really good example of a person who is carving their own path. And I think that the reality is, that you kind of need to carve your own path as somebody who's coming from another place and who doesn't necessarily have the credentials of having worked at a startup before. Now, I think there's something to be said about you come here, but I think before you come here, it's much better to like be online first, right? And he was a great example of that, right? He's such a prolific person when it
Building
comes
in
to
public.
building in public, and that's the most important thing. Like building in public is great. Most people only do the in public part. Like most people don't actually do the real building. They just talk about building. He's like really build stuff.
What is the difference between both?
Oh, I mean, like most people talk about, like for instance, you were like actively building stuff, right? Not just with your media stuff, but also the businesses that you build. Most people who build who build like channels or try to build channels or try to be creators online, they mostly do like this weird sort of pseudo like I'm a creator and I'll teach you how to be rich type content or something. And it's just like, and some of those people obviously do phenomenally well, but most of them, it just comes off as completely like unreasonable and not very good. And the same thing with builders. Like there are a lot of people who are building in public, but they're not actually building anything. They're not actually putting anything out there. I would actually say that there's something to be said about there are more people probably there are more people who are building in public who. The people who actually build in public don't actually talk that much about building in public, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I've ever heard him use the phrase building in public necessarily. I think that I would describe him as that. You would describe him as that.
Yep.
But it's almost like the type of thing that type of person wouldn't use to describe what they're doing. It's like, of course I would tell people what it is that I'm building. Like, how would they know about it otherwise, right? One of my great sort of non-technical influences is Arnold Schwarzenegger. And his whole thing is like, he got this from Ted Turner actually, which is early to bed, early to rise, work like hell, and advertise. And like the reality is, if you work like hell, but nobody knows that you're working like hell, and nobody knows what you're doing, like then how are they going to possibly be able to engage with it, right? He also Arnold sort of like takes that to another level. It's like, okay, I've made the movie, but that's only part of the job, right? The next part of the job is telling people about it, like making sure that they go and see it. So building in public is the making sure that people go and see it thing, because otherwise, who cares? Like, who knows? It's impossible to actually gain an audience for these things. So the main thing is, again, top geography, in my opinion, is San Francisco. Second is the internet. So get on the internet, be there, build things, put things out into the world. It doesn't actually matter if you're building something that's like this massively successful business. Just build something that's interesting to you. Because the likelihood of it being interesting to other people, if it's interesting to you, don't lie to yourself about whether or not it's interesting to you. But if you're truly interested in it, what you're building, then if you get that out to other people, there will be some other people that resonates with.
Right.
Just try and find those people online and get it in front of them, and they'll be really excited to use it or talk about it. And, there will be a lot of things that you put out there. I'm sure that there are some videos that you've put out there in the past that you thought maybe they would have more resonance than they did with people, right? Yeah. I've certainly put tweets out there, put like apps out there, put features out there where I was hoping that they would have more resonance with people than they did. Or I've shared like an investment with other potential investors. I said, oh, this person would love this. And they're like, I'm not interested in that at all. That happens, right? There are times when you put things out into the world where where your expectation is this is going to be great, people are going to love it, and then it doesn't go over. But that's why you need to continually do it, right? It's not just sort of a one-time thing. It's a series of things. Yeah. And so build that audience, build like followers, build like those connections, DM people. Don't just DM people who are famous, right? In fact, it's much better to DM people who aren't famous, who are maybe just a couple steps ahead of you. So like DM people like Dravia, right? DM people like Aryan, right? Like these are awesome people, and they will, if you send them something respectful and you're not asking for a ton of their time, they'll probably respond to you.
Right.
And I think that it's really good because if you are serious and they see that you're serious, that you're actually making things, like if they go to your X account and they see that you're actually making things and putting them out there, they'll say, oh, this isn't just a person who just wants to talk. This is a person who's actually going and making things. Right. It's really cool. So as long as you're doing that, I think that you have a great opportunity for when you go to SF to actually make something of it. So build your people and your connections online and your relationships online. Some of those people, by the way, don't discriminate. Don't only be talking to people who are in SF. Talk to people who are in other parts of India. Talk to people who are in New York City. Like, just talk to interesting people. And then when you announce that you're going to SF, like, you can DM a bunch of the people that you know at SF and say,
Yeah.
hey, like, who should I be talking to? Are you going to be around?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, that's what happened with us, right? We've been DMing, I think, for a couple of years now.
December,
at
I
this
think
point.
you texted me, and that's
Yeah, yeah. So, like, it's like we just find, you find each other, and I'm DMing new people all the time. Like, I DM'd you in December. I've DM'd. You shouldn't stop DMing. There's no time to stop DMing. Always be DMing interesting people when you come across them.
Yeah, makes sense. So, one thing I wanted to ask for people who are watching this: what's so special about San Francisco, and why should they care?
Yeah. So I think the most special thing about
They've all seen the social network movie.
They've seen the Social Network?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So is that popular, would you say?
It is very popular.
Okay.
People have these streaks of watching it for, let's say, 15 times. Then someone says I've watched it 50 times.
Whoa. Okay. It's funny because I actually just bought the soundtrack, or like played the soundtrack for the team in the office because somebody was mentioning listening to the soundtrack while they were working.
I think it turns on all the builders.
Yeah. So I played that for our team. So I think that and by the way, it's so funny because, like, of course, Facebook, this is actually really important, right? Think about it. Facebook got started not in Silicon Valley. It got started in Boston, where their users were, right? So where are your users is actually a really important question. I was just talking to another founder in ODF, and we were talking about the product that he was building, and he said, my customers are actually probably more likely to be in North Carolina than they are in San Francisco. And he's like, so I'm wondering if I should move to North Carolina or if I should be in San Francisco. I was like, well, if you're really confident about wanting to build for this customer base as your initial customer base, there's nothing better than building for them in person with them, right? Lauren from Roots, she's another ODF founder, incredible, making it easier for people to buy homes. She started in Las Vegas, and she's now in San Francisco, building out of San Francisco, but she goes to Las Vegas all the time because it's her first market. And her knowledge of Las Vegas, the fact that she was able to do something in Las Vegas was really good. The other thing that's important to note is that in her business, real estate, San Francisco is in a complete anomaly compared to the rest of the country. So if she'd focused on building an SF first, it wouldn't have transferred well to almost any other major city in the United States. So she instead started with a city that was a pretty good model for other cities, which is Las Vegas. So it's actually sometimes really bad to build with San Francisco in mind in the case of real estate. But if you're building for startups and startups are your early customers, then you really want to be in San Francisco, right? These are the startups that are most funded, so they have the most money to try new products. They're the most open to trying new products. They are the most likely to give you valuable feedback. They're the most likely to grow because just the reality of it is that the startups in San Francisco are more likely to be successful than startups anywhere else. So if they're your customers, then they're ultimately going to have a much bigger chance of success. And if you scale with them, they continue to use you, you'll have more success. Stripe was in many ways a bet on whether or not these small startups that were using the product would grow and continue to use Stripe, because there wasn't this world where they could immediately go and start servicing Amazon, right? So they needed to think that the companies that they were using with Stripe would ultimately become the next Amazons. So you have, if you're building for builders, it makes a lot of sense to be here. The other thing is the amount of alpha that you get, like the amount of inside information, the sort of, you're at the tip of the spear, you're learning a lot of things that, most people won't learn, months from now, half a year from now, and by the time that they all learn it, it's already like too late. Like the asymmetrical advantage is gone.
Yeah, I think I talked about this. I said that I heard someone say about this. He said that San Francisco is practically 6 months ahead of Bangalore in terms of anything which is happening, in terms of the startups that are being built, the ideas being talked about, the cutting edge work is happening here in San Francisco. And Bangalore itself is at least 6 months ahead of any other city in India, just to give perspective to people who are watching it. So
that's probably true. And I think that's true of anywhere in the world. So if you're listening to this or watching this and you're not in Bangalore, you're in Europe or maybe even in Canada, or even in the United States, you're just not in San Francisco, right? There is this lag between what's happening here And it also, I call it like the telephone effect, which is there's this game where you like whisper something in somebody's ear and they whisper it in somebody else's ear, and it, like when it gets 10 people down, like there's this sort of distortion or sort of a dilution of the actual message. So like the initial message doesn't get fully passed along. There's this degradation, and I think that's what happens too when you have sort of this this geographical divide. Especially if you're not online, by the way, again, because like I do think that the internet is like the second best thing for a reason. It's because a lot of the discussion that's happening in person in San Francisco does spill onto X. And honestly, I think that's the only place. So, you know, to the extent that X is valuable business, like I think it probably is, but I think that it's mostly valuable to me because of the amount of conversation that's happening in the tech world that happens. Just it goes immediately from what somebody says in person to what's being said on X, and I think that that's this incredible information exchange that you just can't get anywhere else.
Makes sense. Now, one question: let's say someone wants to shift to San Francisco and they want to start building. There are plenty of incubators and cohorts that they can be a part of. You have Founders Inc., you have ODF. How do these platforms and these programs help them? And particularly in case of ODF, how has it helped other people so that people can get an idea?
Yeah, totally. So I think there's like two types of programs for the most part, and we should also talk about grants actually in a second here. We could talk about that now or in a little bit, but I think there's two types of programs. There's a program for people who are exploring starting a startup, and there's programs for people who have a startup that they're hoping to like grow and sort of like take to another inflection point. For the most part, things like YC. You know, these other accelerators where they give you money. These are really focused on accelerating something that already exists. You know, occasionally they'll take people who don't have an idea, but for the most part, it's about accelerating an existing thing. There's already a team, all of that. What we do with ODF is we really want to bring people to the place where they could explore whether or not starting a company is right for them. We've had so many phenomenal people go through ODF, realize that starting a company wasn't for them right now, and then end up doing something really remarkable afterwards. So,
for example?
Yeah, of course. So, Li Jin ended up becoming a phenomenal investor. She did ODF. John Hardy. So this is actually back in the day, but John Hardy, he became the first business hire at Mercury, and we've worked with Mercury ever since. There's incredible people over there. But, you know, he went through ODF, has an incredible experience. He's still deeply involved with the community, even though he didn't end up starting a company. You see this all the time. And I think there's something to be said about creating a space for people to determine whether or not now is the right time. And so that's what we do. We don't take any equity. We have a contribute what you can model. So specifically, we're saying to people, hey, if you have money, if you've sold a company before, if you've been an executive at a really successful company, when you join ODF, contribute more money than people who, you know, are students in India who are going to be coming here. And we also have scholarships available and grants and that sort of thing. If people are trying to make it here and they can't make it without
ODF is free basically for people to apply to.
It's free to apply to, yeah. And then the idea is that no equity, no right to invest. Our goal here is to say we want to be really aligned with you. So if in the future you want to go and start a company and you do start a company, you want us to invest, like we can talk about that. But like our goal is we think of this almost as like a public good, right? ODF should exist and be self-sustaining, and that's why we have the contribute what you can model. And it's really remarkable because people contribute in every single cohort that we've done this. We've only done this for 2 cohorts now, but the 2 cohorts that we've done it, we've covered our costs of running the cohort through these contributions. And it really shows the generosity of the community because in theory, somebody could say, you know, some person who doesn't care about community, who doesn't care about what we're doing, doesn't care about the mission, could say, you know, oh, I sold my company for $20 million, and I have $20 million in profits or whatever, and I just, you know, I'm going to do 0, right? Nobody does that, right? Like people are really honest and like contribute what they can, and it creates this incredible goodwill. The people who pay a lot of money are really happy to. The people who didn't pay any money or paid very little because they couldn't afford to are delighted because they're like, okay, like they're making this so it's something that I can participate in, and they're not even like requiring that I give them equity.
Right. And this money is used for like investments?
No, this money is used to run the program.
Okay.
You know, we want the program to be self-sustaining so it doesn't like drain any money off.
And how long is this program exactly, and what do
you
expect from it?
So we have this we call what we call onboarding week. So onboarding week is the IRL portion of ODF that's very structured, and this week is to bring people together from, I would say about about 2/3 of them are from the United States, 1/3 are from abroad, and the third that are coming, and then out of the 2/3 from the United States, I would say about half of those are from the Bay Area, half of them are from other parts of the United States. So, about a third of the total are already living here, already building companies here, or have already built companies here as operators, engineers, that sort of thing. Also, we're mostly technical in the cohorts. So people who have engineering backgrounds or can at least prototype, though I think that might change over time depending on sort of how people define technical. And the idea is we bring them together for a week. And the idea is that this week is going to be, 80 to 100 people who will never be in the same configuration ever again. So you really need to make the most of this week, getting to know people, learning from each other, building these relationships that'll last many, many years into the future. There are so many people that I've gotten to know that have become friends with each other through ODF, where 5 years later, they're still getting together. They're still like really close with each other. They've invested in each other's companies, all of that amazing stuff. And, we have people who have these sort of accountability groups and things like that, where years later they're still meeting on a weekly basis. It's incredible. And then, some of these founders, they have each other on their investor updates, even though they're not investors in each other's companies, just because that's what they did when they started out. So the onboarding week is that week to be together. And then we think of that as like the slingshot that you pull back. And then after the week ends, because the week is very like intense and focused, you let go of the slingshot, and now it's like you're taking all those learnings, those connections, those things that you've done over that week, and you now have time to go and actually make those things happen.
Right.
And then we have all sorts of events, co-working, like no VC demo days, we call them, where it's just the community presenting to each other. We have all of that throughout, the year. We do 4 of these cohorts every year.
Wow. Amazing. So that's basically how people can get in, can start building, can learn from other people, and then launch. I think that's really great. What else do you think someone needs to know when they're coming to Silicon Valley?
I think the really important thing to know
What's an advice that you...
Yeah, for sure. So I think that the first thing is like build some relationships before you get here. We talked about that already. Apply to something like ODF if it seems like a fit and you're interested in being around 80 to 100 people who are at the exact same stage as you. The next thing is think about whether or not what you're working on might actually qualify for non-dilutive grants. So we have this thing called Merge, which is a club for people who are working on ambitious projects. Many of them are sort of science projects that might turn into startups. And they've either gotten funding, microgrant funding, or they're looking for microgrant funding. And microgrants are this really incredible thing. They're like anywhere from like a couple $100 all the way to tens of thousands of dollars. And the idea is that the people who are giving these microgrants want to help people be unblocked from what they're trying to work on. And again, like sometimes these microgrants might be for people who are writing a book. But oftentimes they're much more for people who are working on like hard science problems that just have like material costs associated with them. So if you're trying to build a rocket or a satellite or something like that. And what we do with Merge is we bring all those people together into a community. So it's kind of like, if you think of all of these different microgrants as these little, these like part of this constellation, Merge is sort of the thing that like pulls the constellation together. So you get to meet people who've not just gotten grants from the same program that you have, because you're probably already in some discord with them, but you also get to meet people from Merge and Ventures or 1517 or OSV. And the really cool thing is that you get to have that sort of cross microgrant collaboration and friendships. And then what makes it really special is that we actually give out our own grants and we help people apply for grants. So we have this microgrant guide, which is sort of the definitive microgrant guide on the internet. We can link to it maybe or something like that. But if you just type in Merge microgrant guide, it should probably show up. And the idea is that guide gives you reviews of people who've gone through the process. They talk about what it's like to go through the process with each of the microgrants. And you can contact those people if you have questions. But I think that it's so important to realize that you don't need to go out and try and pitch VCs. There are some people who are just really interested, if you're working on something that's special, to fund that and give you your first couple $100. And the first couple $100 makes a really big difference. I just saw a post from Sunir who did ODF. He received a couple of doses of micro grant funding from different people. Most recently from Tyler Cowen at Emergent Ventures, and it's been incredible to see how that small amount of money. I think he got it from Bagel Fund initially, but which is actually a teammate of mine, but. I think he got like $100 or $200 or something like that initially, and then he got like $20,000 or something from Tyler
Wow.
Cowen, and he's able to like make his dream work. And then of course we gave him a scholarship and for ODF, and he's working on autonomous vehicles, and it's just so cool to see him make all this progress without having to raise any like money from VCs, because ultimately I think that he's at least when he started out, he definitely wasn't in a place where it made sense for VCs to invest. But now he's like building more and more and making incredible progress. And that's really what the goal of these grants are. Also, a lot of them actually will give you money to specifically come to visit San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, sometimes if that's sort of the reason that you're coming because you're working on a specific project and you think that like visiting San Francisco will help, some of them will have that be the reason for the micro grant.
That's amazing. We'll have that link in the description of the
Yeah.
video. One last question that
Sure.
I have for you is, what's one advice to the people who are watching this video? It's been about an hour, I think we've been talking,
Yeah.
for building in 2025. If a 20-year-old needs to build a startup in 2025, what's the one thing that they should keep in mind? Maybe
Yeah.
in AI, for example.
Yeah. So it's actually really good. This is I love to have contradictions. So the first part of the contradiction is don't be too precious about the idea. Just go out there and start working on stuff. Because I think that most people are probably not actually getting out there enough and working on stuff, putting it out there into the world. So that's the first part of the contradiction. The second part that actually makes it a contradiction is that sort of the idea / market is the most important thing of all.
Right.
So don't care about the idea too much. Care about the idea more than anything else, right? Now, why is that? It's because, I think that oftentimes people ask this question of like, well, is it, how do you think about total addressable market? TAM is the acronym there. How do you think about TAM? Like, is the TAM big enough for VCs, or is it big enough for to build a great business? The real question isn't about TAM in the early days. The question is twofold. It's, is the customer ready for the product, right? Like, meaning, are they actually like, if you make it, will they actually be ready to use it, excited to use it, that sort of thing? And then two, it's, are you able to deliver, to that, right, to that customer? So if the customer isn't ready for the product, which I would define as sort of like the market or the idea, right? Then all bets are off, right? So if it's a bad market, not market size, it's just a bad market, meaning the customer doesn't want it, the customer isn't ready for it. It doesn't matter how good you are,
Right.
right? If the customer really, really, really needs something, like desperately needs something, and they're underserved, it actually doesn't matter how good you are, right? Because you could probably do a fairly mediocre job, and like in the early days at least, and still get like a bunch of people who are interested,
So
right?
the first priority should be finding a space where people desperately need a solution for a problem.
Well, this is the contradiction, right? Because the contradiction is that you should probably just start building something, right? And just get like that muscle developed of like building things, like not being precious about like getting them out into the world. But then, like, once you've sort of developed that muscle, or maybe you already are there, so you can sort of disregard that part of it, then you need to start being really serious about, am I solving a meaningful problem? Is a customer actually ready to use this thing, right? But I think that most people like don't fail at both of those things. They fail about like actually just building stuff, right? And they also fail at like actually being honest about whether or not a customer wants it. So you need to have that ability to have that bias towards, I'm going to put things out into the world, with also the ability of saying, not only am I going to put things out into the world, but I'm also going to be like very conscious about whether or not the customer is ready, the customer is receptive, that sort of thing. We were talking about the founder who was charging $29 a month, and some people were complaining about it was too much money, and then other people were like, sign me up, this is great.
It's a deal.
Right? So that to me shows that the customer was ready, right? Not all the customers are ready, right? There are going to be some people who are never ready because they're not your customers, right? But the ones who are ready to pay,
Right.
and that to me is really what makes the difference. Because it doesn't matter how good you are if the customer isn't ready to pay,
Right.
or the customer doesn't want what you want. Or what you've built. And, again, back to Magic School, right? Like ChatGPT, incredible product, one of the most successful product, maybe the most successful product of all time. Teachers actually really didn't like it.
Right.
So even though it's like one of the most successful products in terms of growth and revenue and all that of all time, it still wasn't actually, the teachers weren't ready for it. What the teachers were ready for, as it turns out, was Magic School.
Specialized
a specialized tool, a specialized product that really was built for them in mind. So, that's another thing, right? It's like sometimes the thing that's like the best general purpose tool isn't actually the best specialized tool, and maybe the specialized tool is what people are actually ready for.
That's deep. Do you think a lot of people are going to colleges, like
Sure.
going for degrees and all? Do you think that is an important thing that they should focus on? Or what is an importance of a degree in 2025 according to you?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is to not, if you want to be a founder, if you think that you want to be a founder, then I think what you need to do is you really need to think about what is it that you need to do to get out of sort of the traditional path, because the traditional path is going to continue to be like a gravitational pull to keep you on the ground, right? And the way that you do that is by looking at role models, first and foremost, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger, he wanted to get out of Austria, right? Desperately, he wanted to get out of Austria. For some reason, he felt like America was his place.
Right.
And he looked for role models who had done similarly, through bodybuilding in his case. You need to look at people who did similarly. If you're an entrepreneur, if somebody who wants to be a founder in India, you need to look at people who did similarly, right? How did they do it? What did they do? Follow their stories. Follow them on X. Like, ask them questions. Don't ask them like weird sort of ambiguous questions. Don't ask them to get on a call necessarily. Ask them like real meaningful questions. If you've already sort of searched and they haven't posted them somewhere else, or they don't have a podcast that already answers it. Like, don't ask questions for the sake of asking questions, but ask questions if you need
Specific
answers.
ask.
Yeah, like but you should also have tried to figure it out on your own and tried to see if they've already written about it or talked about it on a podcast somewhere. Because it kind of just seems lazy if you hadn't already done that, right? But the thing is, role models are the most important thing. And, why are we going to see more successful Indian founders? Why are we going to see more successful founders from other parts of the world in San Francisco? Why are we going to see more successful founders from different backgrounds, right? Or different configurations of teams, right? Why are we going to see that? It's because they have role models, right? Historically, we see a company was started by a certain type of person from a certain type of place who looked a certain type of way, who talked a certain type of way. Well, that's going to perpetuate that, right? The only way that you start to see more of those, more people who break that frame, is because they've followed a different path and they've followed in the footsteps of other people. So look for those people. That's the first thing. The second thing is, don't worry too much about, your relationship with your family is really important. And it's very nuanced. And I think it's really important to realize that sometimes people are afraid, not just because of what their friends might say to them, right? About what their son or daughter is doing, right? But they're actually afraid for you because they love you.
Right.
So I think there's something to be said about like, be cognizant that if people are, worried about you, or that it's not necessarily because of themselves. It's because they really want you to be successful,
Right.
and they really love you. So make sure that you're like keeping that in mind, because sometimes it can be tough when you're dealing with this, when you're taking a path that's maybe different than what your parents might have expected you to be taking. The other thing is, I don't necessarily think you need to drop out of school necessarily.
Right.
In fact, if you go and you look online and you sort of read up on it, it might actually be better to like be in school or graduate from school, depending on what kind of visa you might want to get to come to the United States. And then lastly, I think it's really important to really work on things that are just interesting to you, because if you work on things that are interesting to you, they'll actually be very motivating. And that will cause you to spend an irrational amount of time on it. You will figure out ways to like create more time in your day to go and work on those things. Versus if you're just spending time on doing something because you think it's like, oh, a founder must do this, or like, this is a good idea that VCs will be interested in. You might not actually have like a sustained interest to actually like really make do with being a student, maybe a high school student or a college student, and also be building the thing that you ultimately hope to be your full-time thing that you work on at some point.
Amazing. That was the podcast. I hope this podcast helps you find your role model and then start your company, maybe shift here to SF. Thank you so much, Julian.
Thank
It was
you.
amazing chatting with you.
Absolutely.
This was, I think, about 1 hour long, but I'm sure there's a lot of value that people can get from this video. Thanks a lot for watching. Share this with a friend of yours, and we'll see you in the next one.
Right on.
Amazing.